cold came down from the north like a living thing, pressing against the weathered logs of the cabin with fingers of ice. Jedediah Stone stood in his doorway, watching the autumn sun sink behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. The air bit sharp against his face, carrying the promise of early snow. He had built his cabin here, high in the Colorado Territory, where the world dropped away on all sides and a man could see trouble coming from miles off. 3 years now since he'd first notched these logs together. 3 years of silence broken only by wind and the occasional cry of an eagle, the way he wanted it. Jed turned back inside, latching the heavy door against the gathering dusk. The cabin was small but solid, everything in its place. A rope bed in the corner, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs though he only needed one. His rifle hung on pegs above the stone fireplace, cleaned and oiled, ready for use. A man alone needed to be ready. He moved through his evening routine with the precision of long habit. First the fire, coaxing flames from the banked coals, adding split pine until heat pushed back the creeping cold, then to the pot hanging over the flames, stirring the beans and salt pork that would be his supper. Same as last night, same as tomorrow. His hands moved steady and sure, but his mind wandered where it always did when the day's work was done. Back to fields torn by cannon fire, to the screams of horses and men. The war had been over for near 10 years now, but some nights he still woke to the phantom boom of artillery, still tasted gunpowder in the mountain air. He ladled beans onto a tin plate and sat at his table, eating without tasting. Through the single window, darkness had swallowed the mountains. Wind rattled the shutters, and he paused, listening. Something in that wind felt different tonight, heavier, meaner. After supper, he checked on his horse in the lean-to shelter built against the cabin's west wall. The bay mare shifted nervously, ears flicking at sounds beyond human hearing. Jed ran a calming hand along her neck, feeling the tension in her muscles. "Easy, girl, just weather coming." But even as he said it, he knew this was no ordinary weather. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since afternoon, and the wind carried a weight that pressed against his chest. He'd seen storms in these mountains that could bury a man in hours, freeze him solid where he stood. He filled the mare's feed box with extra oats and made sure her water bucket wasn't iced over. Then he hauled in more firewood, stacking it high beside the hearth. If the storm hit like he thought it might, he'd need every stick. The wind rose to a howl as he prepared for bed, driving the first hard pellets of snow against the cabin walls. Jed stripped to his union suit and slid beneath the heavy wool blankets. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he reached beneath his pillow and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a tintype photograph, edges worn soft from handling. Even in the firelight, he could make out Sarah's face, that gentle smile she wore the day they married. Little Daniel sat on her lap, not yet 2 years old, reaching toward something beyond the frame, reaching toward a future that never came. The influenza had taken them while he was fighting in Virginia. He'd gotten the letter 2 months after they were already in the ground. His captain had given him leave to go home, but there was no home left. Just 2 wooden crosses in the churchyard and neighbors who couldn't meet his eyes. He should have been there, should have protected them. Instead, he'd been playing soldier, fighting for causes that seemed mighty small compared to what he'd lost. The guilt sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and permanent. The storm struck in earnest near midnight. Wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, and snow drove horizontal past the window. The walls groaned under the assault, and fine powder sifted through gaps in the chinking. Jed rose to stuff rags in the worst spots, then built up the fire until it roared. He'd weathered bad storms before, but this one felt different, felt angry. The temperature inside the cabin dropped despite the blazing fire, and ice formed on the water buckets 6 feet from the hearth. He pulled on his boots and coat, knowing sleep was impossible now. This was shaping up to be a killer storm, the kind that left dead cattle frozen standing in the fields. Miles away. Naylin pressed herself flat against a massive pine trunk, trying to escape the wind's fury. The deer she'd been tracking was forgotten now. Survival her only thought. She'd seen the storm building, but thought she had time to make it back to her shelter. The mountains had taught her a harsh lesson about pride. Snow drove into her face like needles, blinding her. She'd lost direction in the white chaos, each tree looking like the last. Her buckskin dress, fine protection against normal cold, was soaked through. Ice weighted her hair, and her fingers had gone past pain into dangerous numbness. She forced herself to move, knowing that to stop was to die. One foot, then another, though she couldn't feel them anymore. The wind pushed her sideways, sent her stumbling into drifts that swallowed her to the waist. Each time it was harder to climb out, harder to make her legs obey. 25 winters she had survived, but none like this. She was strong, had learned the ways of mountain and forest from her grandmother, but strength meant nothing to a storm like this. It would kill her without malice, without even noticing. As she struggled through another drift, the wind's howl seemed to carry other sounds. Screams, gunfire, the thunder of horses. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the memories came anyway, as sharp as the driven snow. They'd come at dawn. The bounty hunters, 15 white men with rifles, surrounding the camp while her people slept. She'd been gathering water at the stream when the first shots rang out. By the time she crept back, hidden in the brush, it was over. Her mother, her father, her 2 younger brothers, everyone she'd ever loved lay twisted in the dirt. She'd wanted to run to them, to die with them, but her grandmother's teachings held her back. Living is the only revenge, the old woman had told her once. So Naylin lived, alone, carrying the weight of her people's memory. The wind gusted harder, lifting her off her feet and slamming her into a rock. Pain shot through her ribs, and when she tried to rise, her legs wouldn't hold. She crawled forward on hands and knees, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Time lost meaning in the white rage of the storm. She might have crawled for minutes or hours. Her world narrowed to the next movement, the next breath. Even thought became difficult, her mind thick and slow. Then, through the driving snow, she saw it, a flicker of orange light, there and gone. She blinked ice from her lashes, certain she was seeing death visions. But no, there it was again. Fire, light, warmth, and a white man's cabin. Fear cut through her exhaustion. She knew what white men did to Apache women found alone. Death in the storm seemed cleaner than what waited behind that door. But her body betrayed her, crawling toward the light without her permission. The animal need for warmth overrode everything else. She reached the door and tried to stand, to knock properly, but her legs folded. She fell against the rough wood with a soft thud, her last strength gone. The darkness that had been creeping at the edges of her vision rushed in, and she knew nothing more. Inside, Jed looked up from his vigil by the fire. Had that been something at the door? The wind played tricks. He knew, made sounds that weren't there, but his instincts, honed by war and solitude, prickled. He rose and took his rifle from the wall, checking the load by habit. He lifted the latch and cracked the door open. Wind tried to tear it from his hands, and snow blasted through the gap. He was about to close it again when he saw the dark shape against the threshold. His first thought was that a deer had sought shelter, but then he saw the human hand, dark against the snow. Without thinking, he set the rifle aside and hauled the figure inside, fighting the wind for possession of his door. Once it was barred again, he knelt beside what he now saw was a woman, an Indian woman, dressed in buckskin, covered in ice and still as death. He didn't hesitate. Death was the enemy now, not race or history. He lifted her easily. She weighed no more than a child, and carried her to the fire. Her clothes were frozen rigid, and he had to cut them away with his knife. He worked without embarrassment, seeing only a body shutting down, needing warmth. He wrapped her in his blankets, then began the careful work of bringing her back. Her hands and feet were white with frostbite, and he rubbed them gently, knowing too much heat too fast could cause damage. She moaned softly. A good sign. The dead made no sound. He heated water and dribbled it between her blue lips. Most ran down her chin, but some got through. He kept at it, patient as he'd once been with wounded soldiers. Slowly, color returned to her face. Her breathing deepened. It was near dawn when she finally opened her eyes. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling, confused. Then memory crashed back, and she tried to surge upright. Terror filled her face as she took in the cabin, the white man kneeling beside her. "Easy," Jed said, hands raised to show no threat. "You're safe." She clearly didn't believe him. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the rifle on the wall, the single door, the bed in the corner, then down at herself, wrapped in blankets, her dress gone. She pulled the blankets tighter, eyes never leaving his face. Jed moved slow and careful to the table, poured water from the kettle into a cup. He set it on the floor between them and backed away. After a long moment, she reached for it, movement stiff with pain. The hot cup made her gasp, but she drank deep. They sat in silence, the storm still raging outside. Jed added wood to the fire, trying to look unthreatening. She watched his every move like a hawk watches a snake. The fire began to die despite the fresh wood, and Jed realized the problem. The storm had worsened, if that was possible. The temperature in the cabin was dropping fast. Ice formed on the walls farthest from the hearth. He'd seen this before. In the war, men freezing to death with fires burning right beside them. The cold just too mighty to fight. The woman saw it too. She pulled the blankets tighter, but already her lips were turning blue again. They looked at each other across the dimming light, both understanding the truth. The floor was too cold. Away from the direct heat of the fire, she would freeze. She struggled to her feet, wavering like a newborn colt. Jed tensed, not sure what she intended. She looked at the bed, then at him, then back at the bed. When she spoke, her voice was rough as gravel. The English broken but clear. "Share bed, or I freeze." The words hung in the air between them. Jed felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. Every proper instinct rebelled against the idea. A man didn't share a bed with a woman not his wife. Certainly not with an Indian woman. But looking at her, he saw not an Indian making an improper proposition. He saw a human being making a desperate bargain for survival. The pride in her eyes told him what this cost her. She'd rather die than ask. But she'd rather live than die. He thought of Sarah, of protecting those who needed protecting. This wasn't about desire or propriety. This was about two people surviving a night that wanted to kill them both. Slowly, carefully. He nodded. They approached the bed like it might bite. She climbed in first, still wrapped in blankets, pressing herself against the wall. He followed, fully clothed, lying as far from her as the narrow bed allowed. They lay rigid, backs to each other, the storm howling around them, but warmth was warmth. Slowly, as the night deepened and the cold pressed closer, their bodies relaxed, not toward each other, but away from death. In the darkness, listening to the wind try to tear the world apart, they lay still and silent, sharing nothing but heat and the simple human need to survive. Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying the mountains in white death. Inside, two strangers lay awake through the long hours, separated by inches and centuries, held together by the thin thread of warmth that meant another day of life. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the frosted window, finding them still on the narrow bed, backs turned to each other like two halves of a broken whole. Naylin woke first, her body tense as memory flooded back. The white man's cabin, the storm, her demand. She lay perfectly still, listening to his breathing, feeling the warmth that had kept death at bay through the long night. Jed stirred, and she felt him stiffen as awareness returned. For a moment, neither moved. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they rose at the same time, careful not to touch. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders while he turned his back, busying himself with the fire. The storm still raged outside, though with less fury than before. Snow piled against the door, and wind whistled through tiny gaps in the chinking. They were trapped together, Two strangers bound by walls of wood and walls of ice. Jed went through his morning routine like a man walking in his sleep. Coffee grounds in the pot, snow in the kettle for water, bacon in the cast iron pan. His movements were precise, automatic, a shield against the strangeness of having another person in his space. He could feel her watching him, those dark eyes tracking every gesture. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups without thinking, then stopped, unsure. Did Apache women drink coffee? Did she want any? The simple act of offering became a mountain to climb. Finally, he set the cup on the table and stepped back, pointing from it to her. She approached slowly, wrapped in the blanket like armor. The cup was hot against her cold hands, and the smell was familiar. Trading posts, mission schools, memories she'd rather forget. She sipped carefully, watching him over the rim. He pointed to himself. Jed. The word hung between them. She considered it. This piece of himself he offered. After a long moment, she touched her chest. Nalin? Nalin, he repeated, and something in the way he said it, careful and respectful, made her look away. The bacon sizzled in the pan, filling the cabin with its smoky scent. Her stomach clenched with hunger, but pride held her back. She would not beg for food like a dog. But Jed divided the bacon and set half on a plate, sliding it across the table toward her. A gift, not charity. She ate slowly, with dignity. The days that followed blurred together in a strange dance of caution and necessity. The storm showed no signs of breaking, sealing them in their small world. They developed a language of gestures and simple words, Spanish mixing with English and Apache, creating something new between them. She watched him tend the fire, noticed how he favored his left shoulder when lifting heavy wood. An old wound, she guessed. War wound. She'd seen enough damaged men to recognize the signs. When he went to the lean-to to check his horse, she studied the cabin, learning its corners and shadows. His rifle on the wall, a Bible on a shelf, dusty with disuse. That photograph he kept hidden in his saddlebag. On the second night, she took his torn glove without asking. He started to protest, then stopped, watching her work. Her fingers moved with swift certainty, the bone needle flashing in the firelight. The stitching, when she finished, was finer than any he'd seen, creating a pattern that was both strong and beautiful. "Thank you," he said, and she nodded, handing the glove back without meeting his eyes. They found ways to fill the long hours. He showed her his books, though she couldn't read the words. She drew pictures in the ashes by the hearth, teaching him the Apache names for animals, trees, seasons. Their worlds began to overlap at the edges, carefully, like ice beginning to thaw. The third night brought Jed's demons visiting. He was back in Virginia, cannon fire splitting the air, men screaming, but the faces of the dead soldiers kept changing, becoming Sarah, becoming Daniel, accusing him with their empty eyes. He thrashed in the narrow bed, calling their names, apologies pouring from his lips. He woke to darkness and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Nayland sat by the fire, feeding it small sticks, her back to him. She didn't turn, didn't speak, but her presence was deliberate. She was keeping watch, the way warriors did for wounded comrades. Understanding passed between them without words. She too knew the weight of ghosts. The storm's assault on the woodshed came on the 4th day. They heard the crack of splitting wood, the shriek of nails pulling free. Jed grabbed his coat and gloves, then looked at her. He couldn't secure the roof alone in this wind. She didn't hesitate, wrapping herself in one of his spare coats that hung to her knees. She followed him into the white fury outside. The wind hit like a physical blow, driving snow into their faces, trying to tear them apart, but they moved together, him holding the ladder while she climbed, her passing him rope while he fought to lash the boards down. The wind caught her, nearly tearing her from the roof. Without thinking, he grabbed her waist, pulling her against him until she found her footing. For a moment, they clung together, his strength anchoring her, her balance steadying him. Then the moment passed and they were back to work. But something had shifted between them. They stumbled back inside, soaked and shaking with cold, while he built up the fire. She made coffee with steady hands, dividing the last of the bacon between them. They ate in companionable silence, the storm raging outside making the cabin feel safer, warmer. That afternoon, Nayland found a piece of charcoal in the fireplace and began to draw on smooth bark he'd stripped for kindling. She drew people first, simple figures but full of life. A woman grinding corn, children playing, men on horses. Then her hand stilled, and she drew more figures, these lying still. Above them, crude shapes of men with rifles. Jed watched her face as she drew, saw the memory moving behind her eyes like shadows. When she was done, she set the bark aside and stared into the fire. He understood. This was her story, told the only way she could, after a long time. He rose and went to his saddlebag. The tintype was there, wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah smiled up at him, frozen in time. Daniel on her lap. He brought it to Nayland, handling it like the precious thing it was. She studied the image carefully, seeing not just the woman and child, but the love in how they were positioned, the care in how the photograph was preserved. Jed pointed to them, then to his heart, then made a gesture of something flying away. Gone. Enfermedad, he said, using one of the Spanish words he knew. Sickness. She nodded slowly. Death was death, whether it came from bullets or fever. She handed the photograph back with the same care he'd shown, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Neither pulled away. That night, lying in the darkness with the prescribed space between them, both felt the change. It was no longer about survival alone. The body heat they shared had become something else, something that made them aware of every breath, every small movement. Jed found himself studying her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way she moved with such economy, never wasting a gesture, the way her face changed when she was concentrating on a task, the stern lines softening, her hair, when the firelight caught it, gleamed like a raven's wing. Nayland was equally aware of him, his hands, scarred but gentle when he handled the photograph, the way he hummed sometimes without knowing it, old songs from another life. How he always made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire, the best portions of their dwindling food. On the 5th day, she watched him shave with his straight razor, clearing the stubble from his jaw with careful strokes. When he was done, she surprised them both by reaching out to touch a small scar on his chin he'd missed. Guerra, she asked. War, he nodded. Shrapnel, Gettysburg. She didn't know the word, but she understood. Her fingers lingered a moment before dropping away, leaving an echo of warmth on his skin. The storm began to weaken on the 6th day. They could feel it in the way the wind no longer screamed but moaned, in the longer moments of quiet between gusts. Looking out the window, they could see hints of the world beyond, white-shrouded shapes that might be trees, the vague bulk of mountains. On the 7th morning, they woke to silence. Jed pushed open the door to reveal a world transformed. Snow lay in deep drifts, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The sky above was crystal blue, so bright it hurt to look at. The air was sharp and clean, painful in the lungs, but alive. They stood in the doorway together, blinking in the brilliance. The storm that had trapped them was gone, leaving only its memory in the tons of snow it had dropped. Paths could be broken now. Ways could be found. Nayland stepped out into the snow, testing its depth. It came to her knees, but it would hold her weight. She could leave now, make her way back to the hidden shelter where she cached her few belongings. The thought should have brought relief. Jed watched her calculate distances, routes, possibilities. His cabin would be empty again soon. Just him and the silence. The fire would seem colder, the nights longer. Strange how 7 days could change the shape of a life. She turned back to look at him, something unreadable in her dark eyes. Neither spoke. What was there to say? Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for the warmth. Thank you for seeing me as human. The sun climbed higher, beginning to loosen snow from the pine branches. Somewhere in the distance, They heard it fall with a soft whoosh. The world was waking up, returning to what it was before the storm. But they stood still in the doorway, caught between the warmth of the cabin behind them and the cold, bright world ahead, between what had been and what might be, between staying and going. The moment stretched out, fragile as ice crystals in sunlight. Then Nalin stepped back inside, and Jed closed the door behind them. Not yet. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be today. They returned to their quiet rhythms, but everything was different now. The space in the cabin had changed shape, become something shared rather than invaded. When their eyes met across the room, neither looked away quite as quickly. When they lay down that night, the space between them on the narrow bed seemed vast and unnecessary. Outside, the snow began its slow melt under the sun. Inside, something else was thawing, degree by careful degree. Trust, perhaps, or hope, or something that had no name in either of their languages but lived in the space between their carefully maintained distance. The storm had brought them together. Now they had to decide what to do with the strange gift of each other's presence in a world that would not understand. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Tonight, they were warm, fed, and alive. For people who had lost everything, it was enough. For now, it was enough. The morning sun cast long shadows across fresh snow when Jed woke to find the other side of the bed cold and empty. He sat up slowly, already knowing what he would find. Her blanket was gone. The small bundle of possessions she'd kept in the corner had vanished. Even the bone needle she'd used to mend his glove was nowhere to be seen. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. Squinting against the brightness, there they were, her tracks, clear and purposeful, leading away from the cabin and into the pines. She'd left while he slept, quiet as smoke. The hollow ache that settled in his chest was familiar as an old friend. Loss. It sat heavy beneath his ribs, surprising him with its sharpness. He'd known her less than 2 weeks, yet the cabin already felt wrong without her presence. Too quiet, too large, too much like the tomb he'd built for himself before the storm. He tried to slip back into his old routines, checked the trap lines, tended the horse, chopped wood until his shoulders burned and his hands went numb. But every familiar task felt hollow now. When he made coffee, he still reached for 2 cups. When he sat by the fire, he found himself listening for the soft sound of her breathing. That first night alone, he lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. The space beside him felt vast as a canyon. How had he endured this silence for 3 years? It pressed against his ears, filled with echoes of what was missing. Her quiet movements, the soft scrape of charcoal on bark, that laugh, heard only once, precious as water in the desert. The second morning dawned clear and cold. Jed stood in his doorway, drinking bitter coffee. When he saw it, a thin thread of smoke rising from the aspen grove down valley. Not far, maybe half a mile. His heart did something complicated in his chest, part relief, part something else he couldn't name. He saddled his horse and rode down slowly, not wanting to seem eager or presumptuous. The smoke led him to a small clearing he'd passed 100 times before. But now it held something new. A dome-shaped structure made of bent saplings and what looked like deer hide. A wickiup, built with skill that spoke of ancient knowledge. Nalin emerged as he approached, standing straight and proud beside her shelter. She'd changed back into native dress, buckskin and beads replacing his borrowed clothes. Her hair was braided in a style he hadn't seen before. She looked like herself again, not the frightened creature who'd collapsed at his door. They regarded each other across the snowy ground. He raised a hand in greeting. She nodded once, formal and distant. The message was clear. She was here, but on her own terms, independent. Not fleeing, but not surrendering either. Jed touched his hat and turned his horse around, riding back to his cabin with something lightening in his chest. She hadn't left. That was enough for now. Over the following days, they developed a new language, one written in objects and gestures rather than words. He noticed her tracks leading to the creek for water and decided to leave something on the large flat rock she passed. A small sack of flour, a wrapped portion of bacon, Nothing that would wound her pride, just sharing, as neighbors might. 3 days later, he found his offering gone and something left in return. A rabbit, cleanly dressed and ready for the pot. Fresh meat, when his own snares had been empty for a week. The trade was more than fair. She was showing him she could provide too. This silent exchange continued as the snow began its slow retreat. He left salt and coffee. She left deer jerky, perfectly smoked. That lasted longer than anything he could make. He left fish hooks made of bent nails. She left a small pouch of herbs that, when brewed into tea, eased the ache in his wounded shoulder. One morning, he discovered a pair of moccasins on his doorstep. Not just any footwear, but works of art, smoked deer hide, soft as butter, decorated with porcupine quills in a pattern that seemed to dance in the light. When he tried them on, they fit as if she'd measured his feet in his sleep. His worn boots looked crude and clumsy in comparison. He wore them to check his trap lines, marveling at how silent they were on the forest floor. For the first time in years, he moved through the woods like a ghost. Hearing birds and small animals that usually fled at his approach, the gift was more than footwear. It was a piece of her world, shared. February gave way to March, and the world began to change. Water dripped constantly from the eaves, a steady percussion that spoke of winter's grip loosening. The creek, locked in ice since December, began to murmur and crack. On southern slopes, bare patches of earth appeared like promises. The smell of spring came first, wet earth, pine sap running, the green scent of things ready to grow. Jed stood outside his cabin one morning, breathing deep, when he saw Naylin by the creek. She was kneeling by the water, washing something, her movements careful and precise. Without planning to, he walked down to her. She heard him coming, she always did, but didn't tense or move away. When he was close enough to see what she was doing, he stopped in surprise. Seeds? She was cleaning seeds, sorting them into small leather pouches. She looked up at him, then gestured to the ground near his cabin where snow had melted away. Her meaning was clear. Planting time would come soon. He nodded, understanding, then made his own gesture. Come, plant with me. For a long moment, she studied his face, then she smiled. Just a small thing, but real, and nodded. They began the next morning. Jed had tools, a plow, hose, shovels, but only vague knowledge of gardening. Sarah had kept their small plot back home, coaxing vegetables from the ground with a skill he'd never learned, but Naylin knew the land like she knew her own hands. She showed him which spots would drain well, which would hold moisture through the dry summer. Together they cleared rocks, broke ground, worked compost into the soil. She taught him to read the subtle signs, where wild onions grew. The soil was rich, where nothing sprouted. The ground was sour. Her knowledge went beyond vegetables. As they worked, she would stop to point out plants he'd walked past 1,000 times. This one, she showed him through gestures, eased pain. That one helped wounds heal clean. Another could break a fever. She was patient when he confused similar-looking leaves, showing him again how to identify each one. In return, he shared what he knew. How to use the metal tools that made breaking ground easier. The best way to build raised beds that would warm faster in spring. How to read the almanac he'd bought in Denver. Though she seemed skeptical of wisdom that came from marks on paper rather than from watching the world. They developed a rhythm, working side by side through the lengthening days. Sometimes they would accidentally brush against each other, reaching for the same tool, passing seed packets, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as before. The careful distance they'd maintained was shrinking, inch by inch. The stump changed everything. It was a massive pine stump, left from when Jed cleared the cabin site. For 3 years it had squatted there, too big to dig out, too green to burn, but now it blocked the best spot for corn. According to Naylin's assessment, it had to go. They spent a whole morning digging around it, exposing roots thick as a man's arm. Jed attacked it with an axe, while Naylin worked with a steel bar, leveraging stones under the roots. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool air. This was war, and the stump was winning. Finally, frustrated beyond measure, Jed wedged the bar deep and threw his whole weight against it. The root cracked free so suddenly that he lost his balance, windmilling his arms as he tumbled backward into the spring mud they'd churned up with their digging. He landed flat on his back with a splat that knocked the wind from him. Mud covered him head to toe, cold and clinging. He lay there stunned, looking up at the sky, wondering if anything was broken. Then he heard it, a sound like birdsong, high and bright. He turned his head to see Nylon with one hand pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. She was trying not to laugh, but the battle was lost. The sound burst free, pure, unrestrained joy that transformed her face entirely. It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He started laughing too. Couldn't help it. Here he was, a grown man defeated by a stump, wearing half the garden. They laughed together until tears came, until their stomachs hurt, until the absurdity of everything, the stump, the mud, their strange situation, seemed like the funniest thing in the world. After that, something shifted between them. The last walls of formality crumbled. He would do small things to amuse her, juggle pine cones, make faces behind the horse's back, tell stories with his hands about his failures at farming. Each laugh was a gift he treasured. One evening, after a long day of planting, they sat by a fire outside the cabin. The stars were coming out, brilliant in the clear mountain air. They'd worked hard, and the good kind of tired filled their bones. Tomorrow there would be more work, but tonight there was peace. Jed found himself talking, really talking, for the first time since the war. He told her about meeting Sarah at a church social, how her father hadn't liked him at first, how Daniel had been born during a thunderstorm, coming into the world squalling louder than the thunder, how the boy's first word had been horse, clear as day. His voice grew thick when he told her about the letter, how it had found him in a field hospital where he was recovering from shrapnel wounds, how he'd read it 5 times before the words made sense. Gone, both gone. The fever took them quick. The neighbor woman wrote, nothing nobody could do. When he finished, silence stretched between them. Then Nylon reached across the space and took his hand. Her palm was calloused from work, warm from the fire. She didn't speak. Words weren't needed. The simple contact said everything. I understand. I'm here. You're not alone. They sat that way as darkness deepened, hands linked, watching the fire die to embers. Spring came in earnest over the following weeks. The aspen trees budded out in that particular shade of green that looked like hope itself. Wildflowers pushed through last year's dead grass. The whole world seemed to be waking up, stretching, coming alive. They worked the garden every day now. The wickiup still stood in the aspen grove, but more and more of her things migrated to the cabin. A beaded pouch here, a basket there. She started staying for supper, then staying later, until it seemed foolish for her to walk back in the dark. The first night she stayed, they lay in the bed with careful space between them, just as they had during the storm. But it was different now. The space hummed with possibility, with all the words they couldn't say. When morning came, they were closer, though neither remembered moving. Days passed in work and quiet companionship. Evenings by the fire, her teaching him Apache words, him reading to her from one of his few books, though she couldn't understand the words. She liked the sound of his voice, the rhythm of the language. He liked watching her face in the firelight, the way she tilted her head when concentrating. Then came the evening that changed everything. They'd spent the day transplanting wild berry bushes she'd found, promising fruit in years to come. Years to come. The phrase sat between them like a question. As the sun dropped low, painting the mountains gold and purple, they stood together looking at what they'd built. Garden beds stretching in neat rows, the expanded fence to keep deer out, plans for where the corn would grow tall. He turned to look at her, and found her already watching him. The sunset light caught in her dark eyes, turned her skin to copper, without planning to. He reached up and touched her face, gentle as he'd touch a wild thing that might flee. She didn't flee. She leaned into his palm, her eyes never leaving his. The air between them crackled like fire. everything they'd been moving toward, every careful step and cautious gesture, led to this moment. He kissed her as the sun touched the mountain peaks. Soft at first, a question more than a statement. She answered by stepping closer, her hand finding the back of his neck. The kiss deepened, became something inevitable as spring following winter. All the loneliness, all the loss, all the careful hope they'd been building, it was all there in that kiss. When they finally drew apart, the stars were coming out. She said something in Apache, too soft for him to catch. Then, taking his hand, she led him inside the cabin. Their cabin now, that night. They became lovers in truth, not the desperate sharing of warmth that had begun their story, but a choosing, a claiming. For Jed, it was like coming back to life after years of walking death. For Nalin, it was trust made flesh, safety found where she'd least expected it. In the weeks that followed, they made a life together. Her belongings moved from the wickiup to the cabin. They expanded the single room, adding space for her things, for the life they were building. She carved symbols into the doorframe, Apache blessings for protection, for abundance, for love. He built her a loom so she could weave. They were careful when they went to the trading post, knowing how the world saw them. But in their valley, they were just Jed and Nalin, man and woman. Two people who had found each other in a storm and chosen to weather all the storms to come together. Summer arrived in full glory. The mountains green and alive, their garden thrived, promising abundance. In the evenings, they would walk together, her teaching him to see the land through her eyes, him sharing stories of places beyond the mountains. They made plans for a root cellar, for a larger cabin, for the years stretching ahead. Sometimes Jed would wake in the night and watch her sleeping, still amazed she was there. Sometimes Nalin would touch his face while he slept, marveling at the strange turns that had brought her to this place, this man, this unexpected peace. They had both lost everything once, but here, in this high valley, they had found something new. Not a replacement for what was gone, nothing could be that, but something different. Something theirs, a love built on shared grief and growing trust, on laughter over fallen stumps and quiet evenings by the fire. The world beyond their valley might not understand, but the mountains knew, the aspens knew, the garden knew, growing green and strong under their joined hands. And that was enough. It was more than enough. Summer came to their valley like a blessing. The garden they'd planted together grew thick and green, corn stalks reaching toward the sky, beans climbing the poles Jed had set, squash vines spreading their broad leaves across the dark soil. Every morning they worked side by side, Nalin teaching him to read the subtle signs of each plant's needs, Jed's strong back making light work of heavy tasks. The cabin grew too. As spring turned to summer, they added a new room, working in perfect harmony. Jed felled the straightest pines he could find, notching them with practiced skill. Nalin gathered clay from the creek bank and mixed it with grass to make chinking, sealing every gap against winter winds that seemed impossibly far away. She wove blankets on the loom he'd built, bright patterns that brought color to the rough wood walls, into the doorframe of the new room. She carved symbols with her knife, spirals for life, mountains for strength, stars for guidance. It was in this new room, their private space away from the main cabin, that she told him about the child. She took his hand one evening and placed it on her still flat belly, her eyes holding his with a mixture of joy and fear. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the wonder of it. Then he pulled her close, whispering promises against her hair. This child would be protected. This child would be loved. This child would live. They told no one, keeping the secret close like a treasure too precious to share. But it colored everything. The way he wouldn't let her lift heavy buckets, the way she gathered certain herbs and dried them carefully, the way they both looked at the cabin with new eyes, seeing a home for more than two. The peace broke on a hot July morning. Jed was fixing the fence when he heard horses, not one or two, but several, riding hard. He straightened, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against the fence post. 4 men crested the ridge, rough-looking even from a distance, the kind who seemed to carry trouble in their saddlebags. The leader he recognized with a cold drop in his stomach, Silas Croft. They'd worked a cattle drive together 5 years back, and it had ended with Jed pulling Croft off a Mexican boy he'd been beating half to death over some imagined slight. Croft had sworn vengeance then, but Jed had never expected to see him again. The years hadn't improved him. If anything, they'd distilled his meanness into something harder, uglier. His face was weathered leather stretched over sharp bones, his pale eyes like dirty ice. The 3 men with him looked cut from the same cloth. Drifters, claim jumpers, the kind who took what they wanted and moved on. They rode right up to the cabin like they owned it, horses trampling the neat rows of beans. Nayland appeared in the doorway, and Jed saw Croft's eyes fix on her with an expression that made his blood burn. "Well, well," Croft drawled, not bothering to dismount. "Jed Stone, heard you'd gone native, but I didn't believe it till now." Jed moved to stand between Croft and the cabin, between Croft and Nayland. "State your business and move on." "Business?" Croft laughed. An ugly sound. "We're here to do some prospecting. This here's public land, far as I know. 'Less you got papers saying different." Jed's claim was solid, filed proper in Denver, but he knew paper meant nothing to men like these. "This valley's taken. Find somewhere else." Croft's eyes slid past him to Nayland again, and his smile turned nastier. "Living in sin with a savage, your mama would be spinning in her grave. Stone, though I reckon she's got her charms, if you like them wild." The words were meant to provoke, and they nearly worked. Jed's hand twitched toward his gun, but he held steady. 4 to 1 were bad odds, and Nayland was in the open. "Get off my land," he said, voice quiet and level. "Now." "Your land?" Croft leaned forward in his saddle. "Way I see it, you forfeited any claim to civilized property when you took up with that. Probably forfeited a lot of things." The other men chuckled, emboldened by their leader. One of them, a greasy-haired fellow with few teeth, added his own vile comment about Nayland that made Jed's vision go red at the edges. "Last warning," Jed said. Croft studied him for a long moment, taking in the rifle, the set of his shoulders, the cold readiness in his eyes. Something he saw there made him straighten slightly. "We'll be camping yonder," he said finally, jerking his head toward the far side of the creek. "Public land. Like I said, you can't run us off for prospecting public land." They turned their horses, deliberately trampling more of the garden as they went. "At the creek." Croft turned back. "Real shame, Stone. You could have been somebody. Instead, you're playing house with an animal." His eyes found Nayland one more time. "Don't worry. We'll be neighborly." They made camp just far enough away to be legal, just close enough to be a threat. Jed could see their fire from the cabin window, hear their voices carrying on the night air. He cleaned his rifle and pistol while Nayland watched, her face carefully blank. "Pack runners," she said finally. It was what her people called men who scavenged on the edges of others' lives. "They will not leave easy." "I know." He looked at her, saw the shadow in her eyes. "They won't touch you, I swear it." She nodded, but that night she kept her knife close, and neither of them slept well. The harassment started small. Dead animals left where they'd find them. The creek running muddy from where the men washed upstream. Gunshots in the night that sent the horses into panic. Jed's trap lines were robbed. His markers moved. When he went to check the far pasture where he sometimes found game, he discovered they'd been there first, leaving nothing but bones and waste. Worse was what it did to Nayland. She grew quiet, watchful, starting at sudden sounds. The nightmares returned. He'd wake to find her sitting up, staring at nothing, reliving horrors he could only imagine. She stopped singing while she worked, stopped laughing at his attempts to cheer her. The joy they'd built was curdling into fear. After a week of this, Jed had enough. He saddled his horse one morning, told Nayland to bar the door behind him, and rode to Croft's camp. They were waiting for him, spread out casual but ready. Croft sat on a log, cleaning his nails with a large knife, the picture of unconcern. "Morning, Stone. Come to be neighborly. Come to give you one chance," Jed said, staying mounted. "Clear out. Today. Don't come back." "Or what?" Croft stood slowly, his men shifting to better positions. "You'll shoot us all? 4 men, just trying to make an honest living? That how you want to play this? There's nothing for you here. No gold, no silver. Nothing but trouble if you stay." "Oh, I don't know about that." Croft's smile was like a wound in his face. "Seems to me there's plenty here worth taking, just requires the right approach." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. One of the men chuckled, low and mean. "See the way I figure it?" Croft continued. "You've got yourself a nice setup here. Too nice for a man who consorts with savages. Makes me think maybe you need reminding about how the world works, about the natural order of things." "The only order here is mine," Jed said. "This is my land, my home. You're not welcome." "Your home?" Croft stepped closer, though still out of easy reach. "Built with white hands for a red savage to nest in. That ain't a home. Stone, that's an abomination." Jed's hand moved to his gun, but Croft raised both hands in mock surrender. Now. No need for violence. We're just talking, just explaining how things are gonna be. We'll prospect where we please, hunt where we please, and if we happen to encounter your woman, well, we'll be sure to treat her exactly as she deserves." The words were carefully chosen, the threat clear but nothing actionable. Nothing that would justify shooting except in Jed's own mind. Croft knew the game, knew how to push without quite crossing the line that would justify violence in the eyes of any law. "You come near her. What? What'll you do, Stone? You gonna fight all 4 of us? Leave her alone and unprotected while you try? Or maybe you'll run to town. Tell the sheriff you need help protecting your savage woman from honest prospectors?" The other men laughed at that, knowing as well as Jed did how that would go. No lawman would ride days into the mountains to protect an Apache woman living unmarried with a white man. Jed turned his horse without another word, riding back with their laughter following him. He'd learned what he needed to know. There would be no reasoning with Croft, no peaceful resolution. It was just a matter of when, not if, violence would come. He told Naylin everything, not wanting to hide the danger from her. She listened in silence, then went to the chest where she kept her few possessions. From it, she pulled items he'd never seen before: arrowheads, a bow stave, sinew for stringing. "I need time," she said simply, and he understood. She would not be caught helpless again. They prepared quietly for what they both knew was coming. Jed moved extra ammunition where it could be reached quickly, checked sight lines from the windows, reinforced the door. Naylin worked on her bow, her fingers remembering skills learned in childhood. They were careful never to leave the other alone, always watching. The tension stretched through another week, taut as a bowstring. Then Jed had to check his furthest trap line, a full morning's ride away. He almost didn't go, but they needed the meat, and showing fear would only encourage Croft. "Bar the door," he told Naylin. "Don't open it for anyone but me." She nodded, the bow in her hands, quiver at her hip. "Hunt well," she said, their usual parting. But the words carried weight now. He rode out at dawn, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but they couldn't live under siege forever. He pushed hard, checking the traps as fast as possible. The 2 rabbits he found seeming poor reward for the risk. He was still an hour from home when he heard the shot. Sound carried strange in the mountains, but he knew that echo, knew it came from the direction of the valley. He spurred his horse hard, riding reckless over rough ground, heart hammering against his ribs. More shots, the crack of rifle fire punctuating the thunder of his horse's hooves. He crested the final ridge at full gallop, saw smoke rising from the direction of his cabin, saw figures moving. 3 men were trying to break down his door while smoke poured from where they'd tried to set fire to the woodpile. But they were having troubles of their own. As he watched, an arrow sprouted from the door frame inches from one man's head, making him dive for cover. "Naylin," She'd gotten out, was somewhere in the trees, using the skills her people had taught her. Even as he rode, another arrow flew from a different position, keeping the men pinned, but they were figuring it out, spreading out to flank her position. Jed saw one man moving through the brush, trying to get behind where the arrows came from. Saw Nalin break from cover, trying to reach a better position. Saw the man raise his rifle. The rage that took Jed then was cold and absolute. He drew his pistol at full gallop, an impossible shot, but his hand was steady as stone. The gun bucked, and the man spun and fell. Then he was among them, using his horse as a weapon, riding one down before leaping free. His fist connected with another's jaw before the man could bring his rifle around. They went down in a tangle, rolling in the dirt. The man was strong, desperate, but Jed fought with something beyond desperation. This was his home, his woman, his child she carried. He fought like what he was, a man with everything to lose. A rifle butt caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He rolled aside as another man joined the fight. 2 on 1 now, and somewhere Croft was still out there. He managed to get his feet under him, drew his knife as they circled. Then Nalin was there, moving silent as smoke. Her knife took one man in the shoulder, making him scream and stumble back. The distraction was enough. Jed's fist dropped the other, leaving him groaning in the dirt. "Where's Croft?" he gasped. A gunshot answered him. Nalin cried out, her hand going to her side where red was already spreading. She stayed on her feet but swayed, and Jed saw Croft stepping from behind the cabin, rifle raised for a second shot. Jed moved without thinking, putting himself between them. Croft's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him half around, but he kept his feet. His own gun came up steady, and this time he didn't miss. Croft fell back against the cabin wall, surprise on his face. He tried to raise his rifle again, but his strength was going. As Jed watched, he slid down the wall, leaving a red streak on the logs. Should have stayed away. Jed told him. Croft tried to speak, but only blood came out. His eyes fixed on something past Jed's shoulder, and the hatred there was terrible to see. Then the light went out of them, and he was just another dead man in a world full of them. Jed turned to find Nalin on her knees, both hands pressed to her side. Not her side, lower, her belly, where their child grew. The blood was spreading fast, too fast. "No!" The word tore from him as he dropped beside her, his own wound forgotten. "No, no, no!" She looked at him with eyes already going distant. "Jed," she said, his name soft as a prayer. He pressed his hands over hers, trying to stop the bleeding, but it came through his fingers like all the things he'd never been able to hold on to. Like Sarah, like Daniel, like every promise he'd ever made to keep someone safe. "Stay with me," he begged. "Please, stay with me." But she was already falling, and he caught her, held her while the mountains watched in silent witness. The men who could still move had fled, leaving their dead behind. The fire in the woodpile had died to smoke. Nalin's eyes found his, and in them he saw not fear, but sorrow. Not for herself, but for him, for what this would do to him. Her hand touched his face, leaving red on his cheek. "Live," she whispered, the same word her grandmother had given her, the word that had kept her going after she lost everything. Then her eyes closed, and she went limp in his arms. Jed pulled her close, his shoulder screaming protest, and did something he hadn't done since reading that letter in a field hospital. He wept, great, tearing sobs that shook his whole body, that echoed off the mountains like the cries of a wounded animal. When the tears finally stopped, the sun was low in the sky. His shoulder had gone numb, his shirt soaked with blood. His and hers mingled together. 3 dead men lay scattered around his cabin, and the woman he loved was still and cold in his arms. But she was breathing, faint, so faint he thought at first he'd imagined it. But there, the slightest rise and fall of her chest. Hope hit him like a physical blow. He gathered her up, stumbling toward the cabin. She needed help, needed it now, and he would move heaven and earth to save her. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Jed worked through the night, his shoulder screaming with every movement, but he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Naylin lay on their bed, pale as winter moonlight, her breathing shallow and uneven. The bleeding from the gunshot had slowed, but there was other blood now, and with it came the terrible understanding of what was happening. He'd seen it before, on the farm when he was young. Mares that lost their foals after injury or fright. He knew what the cramping meant, knew what the blood signified. Their child was leaving them, another casualty of Croft's hatred. Naylin's eyes opened as another wave of pain took her. She gripped his hand with surprising strength, her face contorting. No sound escaped her lips. She was Apache, trained from childhood to endure in silence, but tears ran down her cheeks. "I'm here," Jed whispered, wiping her face with a cool cloth. "I'm here." But being there wasn't enough, had never been enough. Not for Sarah, not for Daniel, and now not for Nalin and their unborn child. He held her through the long, terrible hours as her body did what it must, expelling the tiny life they'd created together. When dawn came pale through the windows, it was over. Naylin lay exhausted, her face gray with blood loss and grief. Jed wrapped the small, too small form in a piece of the blanket Naylin had woven, his hands shaking. A son. They would have had a son. He buried the child beneath the apple tree they'd planted together, the one that wouldn't bear fruit for years yet. Naylin was too weak to leave the bed, but he saw her lips moving in what might have been prayer in her own tongue. When he came back inside, muddy and hollow-eyed, she was staring at the ceiling. "Our child is gone," she said, the words flat and final. "Yes, because of them. Yes." She turned her head to look at him then, and what he saw in her eyes matched what he felt in his chest, a grief so profound it had transformed into something else, something harder and sharper than any blade. For 3 days, Jed tended her wounds and kept the cabin running, but his mind was elsewhere. He could see the 3 surviving men in his mind's eye, wounded, frightened, running. They would head for the nearest town, maybe try to lose themselves in the mining camps. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. On the 4th morning, Naylin was strong enough to sit up. She watched him oil his rifle, check the action of his revolver, sharpen his knife until it could split a hair. "You are going after them," she said, not a question. "Yes. It will not bring back our child?" "No, but it will make sure they never do this to anyone else." She studied his face for a long moment. The gentle man who had laughed with her in the garden was gone, replaced by someone she recognized from her own past, a warrior who had seen too much, lost too much, and had nothing left to lose. "The darkness," she said softly. "It will take you. It already has. Then come back to me, even dark. Come back." He crossed to her, kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. It was the only soft thing left in him. "Wait for me." He packed light, ammunition, jerky, water, nothing else. No bedroll, no coffee, no comfort. Comfort was for men who deserved peace. He saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness and rode out without looking back. The trail was easy to follow at first. 3 wounded men, 1 horses between them, leaving blood and broken branches in their wake. They'd headed north, probably making for the old mining road that led to Leadville. Jed followed at a steady pace, not pushing. Let them think they'd escaped. Let them start to feel safe. By noon he found their first camp, cold ashes and bloody bandages. They'd stopped to tend wounds, arguing by the look of the trampled ground. Fear was setting in, making them careless. Good. He dismounted and studied the signs. 1 man was hurt bad, dragging his left leg. Another had lost significant blood. The bandages were soaked through. The 3rd seemed mobile but was supporting the others, slowing them all down. Naylin had taught him to read the land like a book, and now he read a story of panic and pain. They'd tried to hide their trail after this camp, but wounded men couldn't think clear. He found where they'd doubled back, where they'd waded through a stream trying to lose pursuit they weren't even sure was coming. As the sun peaked, he found fresh sign. They were maybe 4 hours ahead now, moving slower, The wounded man's drag marks were deeper, more frequent. They'd have to stop soon, have to rest. He made no camp that night, just waited in the darkness above a likely stopping place. Sure enough, near midnight, he saw the small flicker of a fire in the canyon below. Fools, but desperate men did foolish things. He left his horse tied and went on foot, moving silent as Nalin had taught him. The fire showed him 3 shapes, one lying still, probably the badly wounded one. 2 others sitting close to the flames, no watch posted. They thought they were safe. One of the sitting men was Hank Bowman, the greasy-haired one who'd made those vile comments about Nalin. Jed remembered his face, remembered the laugh that had followed his words. The other was younger, maybe 20, with a scraggly beard of someone trying to look older than his years. Jed could have shot them from cover. Ended it clean, the old Jed would have. But the cold thing inside him wanted them to know. Wanted them to understand that actions had consequences, that some sins couldn't be outrun. He waited until near dawn, when men slept deepest. Then he took their guns, tossed them into the darkness, and kicked dirt over their fire. Bowman came awake with a start, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. His eyes went wide when he saw Jed standing over him, rifle pointed casual but steady. Morning, Hank.
Stone, we didn't. It was Croft's idea, all of it. Croft's dead. So's my child.
The words hung in the cold air. Bowman's face went pale as understanding dawned. We didn't know she was... we never meant... You meant to burn my home. Meant to terrorize my woman. Meant to take what wasn't yours. Jed's voice was flat, emotionless as stone. Well, you took something. Now I'm here to collect the debt. The younger one was awake now, pressing back against a boulder. Please, mister, I just hired on for the prospecting. I didn't know. You knew enough to point a gun at a pregnant woman. The wounded man stirred, but didn't wake. Jed saw it was the one Nalin had stuck with her knife. Infection had set in. He could smell it from here. Man was dying anyway. I'll give you what I didn't give Croft. Jed said, a chance. There's a rifle somewhere out in those rocks. You find it before I count to 20. Maybe you live 1, 2. They scrambled up. Bowman cursing, the younger one whimpering. They ran in different directions, searching desperate in the pre-dawn gloom. 10, 11. Bowman tripped over a rock, went down hard. The younger one was on his hands and knees, feeling around blind. 18, 19. Neither found the rifle. They couldn't have. Jed had thrown it off the cliff. They stood there panting, waiting. 20. The shots echoed off the canyon walls, sharp and final. Both men dropped where they stood. Jed walked over, made sure of them, then turned to the wounded man. He was awake now, fever-bright eyes staring up. Kill me, he whispered. Just do it. Jed considered. This one would die slow from the infection. Might take days. But he thought of Nalin, laboring through the night to birth death, and found his mercy had run dry. No. He left the man there with his fever and his fear, taking all the horses when he went. Let the coyotes and the buzzards finish what Croft had started. But Croft himself was still out there. The leader had split off from the others sometime after that first camp. His trail led east, toward the old trapper paths that wound through the high country. Smart. A man alone could move faster, hide better. For 2 days Jed tracked him through terrain that would have killed a lesser man. Croft was good. He'd give him that. Doubled back twice, laid false trails, used every trick, but Jed had learned from the best. Nalin had shown him how to see what wasn't there as much as what was. A branch that should have been broken but wasn't. A rock disturbed then carefully replaced. The tiny signs that marked a man trying too hard to be invisible. On the 3rd day, the trail led into a box canyon. High walls on 3 sides. Either Croft had made a fatal mistake or he was laying a trap. Jed dismounted, approached on foot with rifle ready. He found Croft's horse first, tied to a scraggly pine. Foam dried on its mouth from being ridden too hard. The canyon narrowed ahead, perfect for an ambush, but something was off. No birds, no small sounds. Death had already visited here. He found Croft slumped against a boulder near the canyon's end, rifle across his lap, eyes closed. For a moment Jed thought he was dead, but then those pale eyes opened, focusing slowly. "Stone." The word came out bloody. Jed saw the dark stain spreading across Croft's shirt. The wound from their fight had gone bad. Probably been bleeding inside all along. "Took you long enough." Croft continued, trying for his old sneer but managing only a grimace. Jed kept his rifle trained on him but didn't shoot. Not yet. "The others are dead." "Good. Useless cowards anyway." Croft coughed, speckling his chin with red. "How's your squaw?" The cold thing inside Jed wanted to make him suffer, but he kept his voice level. "Alive. Our child isn't." Something flickered in Croft's eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe satisfaction. Hard to tell with a man like him. Should have stayed away from her. Croft wheezed. "Unnatural. A white man lying with one of them. Against God's law." "Whose God?" Jed asked. "The one who says thou shalt not kill. That God. Better to kill than to muddy the race with savage blood." Even dying, the hatred poured from him like pus from a wound. "My only regret is not finishing the job. Should have put a bullet in her head, sent her to hell with the rest of her heathen kind." The words kept coming, each one uglier than the last. All the poison that had driven him, all the bile that had justified his actions, spilling out with his life's blood. He blamed Nayland for existing, for daring to be loved by a white man, for carrying a child that would have been both Apache and white. Jed listened to it all, letting the words wash over him like filthy water. When Croft finally wound down, gasping for breath, Jed spoke. "You done?" Croft tried to raise his rifle, but his strength was gone. The weapon slipped from nerveless fingers. "Do it," he growled. "Send me to my reward." "No reward where you're going." The shot was clean, center of the forehead. Croft slumped sideways, his hatred finally silenced. Jed stood over the body for a long moment, waiting to feel something. Satisfaction, relief, peace, anything. But there was only emptiness. The deaths hadn't brought back his child, hadn't erased Nayland's pain or his own guilt. He'd thought vengeance would balance the scales, but the scales were broken. Had been broken since that letter found him in Virginia. He left Croft for the scavengers and began the long ride home. 3 days through country that seemed drained of color. The mountains were gray stone, the trees gray-green smudges, the sky a gray bowl overhead. Even his hands looked gray when he studied them, stained with gunpowder and death. On the second night, he dreamed. Not of the war this time, but of the canyon. Croft sat up, hole in his head dripping darkness instead of blood. "You're like me now," the dead man said. "Killer. Nothing else left." He woke, gasping, but the dream followed him into daylight. Every man he'd killed in the war, every man he'd killed since. They all wore Croft's face. They all spoke with Croft's voice, telling him what he already knew. He'd become the violence he'd tried to leave behind. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from another life. Smoke rose from the chimney. A sign Nayland was well enough to tend the fire. He dismounted slowly, feeling older than the mountains. She was sitting in the doorway, wrapped in one of her woven blankets. She'd been watching for him. He knew, watching and worrying and wondering what would ride back, the man she loved or something else wearing his face. He stopped a few feet away, unable to meet her eyes. "It's done." "I know." Her voice was soft, careful. "They're all dead. I know. The word stuck in his throat. What was he? Killer? Protector? Monster? Man? All of those and none of them. She rose, moving slow but steady. Her wound was healing clean. He could see. She would carry the scar forever, but she would live. She crossed the space between them and touched his face with gentle fingers. "You are Jed," she said simply. "You are the man who saved me from the storm, who laughed with me in the garden, who held me while our child left us. You are scarred now. Yes, darker, yes, But still Jed. He wanted to pull away, to tell her she was wrong, that the Jed she'd known was as dead as Croft, but her touch held him, anchored him. In her eyes he saw his own reflection, and it wasn't the monster from his dreams, just a man, weathered and worn, who'd done what he felt he had to do. Can you, he swallowed hard, can you still love what I've become? She didn't answer with words. Instead, she took his hand and led him inside, to their home that smelled of herbs and smoke and life going on despite everything. She sat him at the table and brought him water, then began the slow work of cleaning the trail from him, as her hands moved gentle over his face, washing away the dust and grime. Something inside him began to ease. Not heal, that would take time he might not have, but ease. Like a bone settling back into joint. He was home, changed, damaged, carrying new weight he'd bear forever. But home, and for now, that was enough. The mountains watched in silence as Jed Stone made his way home through the gathering dusk. His horse picked its way careful down the familiar trail, but Jed barely noticed. His body was in the saddle, but his mind was still back in that canyon, standing over Croft's body, waiting to feel something that never came. Naylin saw him long before he reached the cabin. She'd been keeping watch from the doorway every evening since he left, her vigil as constant as the stars. When his silhouette appeared against the dying light, she rose despite the pain in her side, one hand pressed to the wound that was still healing. He dismounted slowly, like an old man, though he'd only been gone a week. When he finally looked up at her, she saw everything in his eyes. The deaths he'd dealt, the darkness he'd walked through, the terrible emptiness that comes from revenge fulfilled. Without a word, she went to him. He fell into her arms like a tree finally cut through, all the strength that had carried him through his hunt draining away at once. His knees buckled, and she caught him, held him up though it pulled at her wound. Together they stumbled into the cabin, him leaning on her, neither speaking because what words could possibly suffice. She helped him to a chair, then knelt to pull off his boots. They were caked with mud and blood, his own from scratches, and older stains she didn't ask about. His clothes smelled of gunpowder and death. She peeled them away piece by piece, and he let her, passive as a child. When she brought warm water and began to wash him, he finally spoke. "They're all dead. I know." She kept her voice soft, neutral, as she cleaned dried blood from a cut on his cheek. "It didn't help. Doesn't change anything." "I know." He caught her hand, stilling it. "I've become him. Become what I hated." She met his eyes then, saw the self-loathing there, the fear that he'd lost himself in violence. "No, you are not him. You killed to protect. He killed from hatred. Dead is dead. The reason doesn't matter to corpses." She had no answer for that, so she resumed washing him, gentle but thorough. When she was done, she led him to their bed. He lay down fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. She curled beside him, not touching, just present. The nightmares started that first night. He was back in the canyon. But Croft wouldn't stay dead. The corpse sat up, that neat hole in his forehead weeping darkness. "Look what you've become," it said with Croft's voice. "Just another killer. That's all you'll ever be now." Behind Croft stood others, the 3 men from the camp, the soldiers from the war. Every life he'd taken lined up to show him his handiwork. They spoke in chorus, a litany of accusation that followed him even after Nolan shook him awake. Days passed in a gray haze. He went through the motions of living, chopping wood, tending the horses, checking trap lines. But it was all mechanical. The cabin felt different now, tainted. Every corner held memories of that day, of Nolan bleeding on their bed, of their child leaving them. The very walls seemed to echo with the loss. Naylin watched him drift further from her, from himself. She was fighting her own battle with grief, her body still weak from the wound and miscarriage. But she'd survived the massacre of her entire people. She knew how to endure. Jed, for all his strength, was drowning in darkness he didn't know how to navigate. One evening, 2 weeks after his return, she found him sitting by the cold fireplace, staring at his hands. They were shaking slightly, and she knew he was seeing blood that soap couldn't wash away. She built up the fire, then sat beside him on the floor for a long time. Neither spoke. Then she began to talk, her voice low and steady. My grandmother told me once about warriors who came back from raids changed, the killing sickness, she called it, men who had done what they had to do but couldn't find their way back to who they were before. Jed didn't respond, but she knew he was listening. She said the only cure was to understand that the man who left and the man who returned were both real, both necessary. The warrior protects, the man loves. They are not enemies, they are parts of the same whole. Your grandmother never met me, Jed said bitterly. Never saw what I'm capable of. She saw plenty of men who thought themselves monsters. Nayland shifted to face him. You think you invented violence, invented guilt. My people knew these things long before your people came. We also knew how to live with them. She told him then of rituals her people used, ways of cleansing not the body but the spirit, of understanding that scars were maps of survival, not marks of shame. She talked until her throat was dry, pouring out the wisdom of generations, trying to build a bridge he could cross back to himself. That night, for the first time since his return, he reached for her in the darkness, not with desire, but with need, the need to feel something besides guilt, to remember what tenderness was. She held him while he wept, great shuddering sobs that shook the bed. She didn't tell him it would be all right. She just held on. The idea came to them slowly, over weeks of careful conversation. They couldn't stay in this cabin where their child had been conceived and lost, where violence had shattered their peace. The walls held too much sorrow. The very ground seemed poisoned with memory. We could leave the valley entirely, Jed suggested one morning. But Nayland shook her head. This is our place. We earned it with blood and tears. We don't run, we rebuild. So they searched their valley with new eyes, looking for a place to start over. They found it in a meadow a mile upstream, protected by aspens, with clear sight lines in all directions, a defensive position. Yes, but also beautiful, with the morning sun painting the peaks gold and a spring bubbling up clear and cold. Taking apart their first cabin was harder than building it had been. Every log held memories. This one they'd placed during that first summer. That one still showed the marks of Nayland's careful chinking. But with each piece they removed, some of the weight seemed to lift. They were not destroying, but transforming, taking what was good and leaving behind what hurt too much to keep. The work was what saved them. Day after day, from dawn to dusk, they labored side by side. Jed felling trees and shaping logs, Nayland preparing the ground and gathering stones for the foundation. Their hands grew calloused, their muscles sore. But it was good pain, clean pain that came from building rather than destroying. They rarely spoke while working, but their old harmony slowly returned. He would reach for a tool and find her already handing it to him. She would struggle with a heavy stone and find him there to help without being asked. In shared sweat and purpose, they began to find their way back to each other. The new cabin rose slowly but solid. They built it stronger than the first, with thicker walls and better sight lines. The door was reinforced, the windows placed for defense as well as light. They were not just building a home, but a fortress, a place where they could feel safe again. As autumn came on, painting the aspens gold, they finished the roof, standing back to look at what they'd built. Jed felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible day. Satisfaction, not happiness, not yet, but the quiet pride of creation rather than destruction. They moved their few possessions on a crisp October morning. Nayland insisted on carrying the tintype of Sarah and Daniel herself, placing it carefully on the new mantle. They are part of your story, she said simply. They belong here too. That first night in the new cabin, they lay in their new bed, wider than the old one, built by Jed's hands from pine that smelled of resin and hope. The ghosts were still there, would always be there, but they seemed quieter here, more at peace. Winter came early and hard, but their new home stood strong against the storms. They had laid in good supplies, and the work of daily survival kept them grounded in the present rather than lost in the past. Slowly, carefully, they began to talk about the future again. It was a morning in late February when Nalin knew for certain. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. The same changes in her body, the same deep knowing. She waited a week to be sure, then another because she was afraid to hope, afraid to speak it into being. She told him by the fire one evening, simply taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. He looked at her, confusion giving way to understanding, then to a fear so sharp it took her breath away. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't lose another—" "Shh." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "This child is different. This child is born from our strength, not our innocence. This child will know parents who have walked through fire and survived. They didn't celebrate, not like before. Instead, they prepared. Jed reinforced every possible defensive position around their new home. Nalin gathered herbs and medicines, teaching him what she knew of birthing in case she needed his help. They were not naive now. They knew the world's cruelty, but they also knew their own strength. The pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer. Nalin grew round while their garden grew green. They worked together as always, though Jed wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, and she didn't argue. This caution was not weakness but wisdom. On quiet evenings, they would sit outside their new home, watching the sun set over the peaks, her hand on her growing belly, his arm around her shoulders. They didn't talk much about the baby, afraid perhaps that words would jinx it. But sometimes Jed would feel movement under his palm and his eyes would fill with tears, grief and hope, mixed together like snow and rain. The child came with the first snow of autumn, as if winter itself was bringing new life. The labor was long but uncomplicated. Nalin strong and determined. Jed steady beside her despite his terror. When the baby's cry filled their cabin, healthy, angry, alive, they both wept. A daughter, perfect and whole, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. They named her Sarah, for the past that shaped them, and Morningstar and Apache, for the future that awaited. 1 year later, snow fell soft outside their windows as Jed stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching. Nalin sat in the rocking chair he'd made, nursing their daughter by lamplight. The baby's tiny hand clutched her mother's finger, and Nalin was humming something low and sweet, an Apache lullaby older than memory. He studied them, his woman, his child, and felt the fullness of what they'd built. Not just the cabin, sturdy and warm around them, not just the life they'd carved from wilderness and sorrow, but this moment, this peace that was not the absence of pain but the presence of something stronger. The scars remained, would always remain, in the lines that grief had carved in his face, in the watchful way Nalin's eyes still tracked every distant sound, in the rifle that hung loaded by the door and the knife she kept always within reach. They were not unmarked by what they'd endured, but scars were proof of healing, proof that what was torn could mend. Their daughter would grow up knowing both her parents' strength and their shadows. She would learn Apache ways and white ways, would speak both languages, would carry both traditions. She would know that she was born not from innocence, but from love tested in the crucible and found true. Jed crossed the room quiet as he'd learned, knelt beside the rocking chair. Nalin smiled at him, that rare, precious smile that had first broken through his defenses during a spring planting. Their daughter opened her eyes, gray as winter sky, and regarded him solemnly. "She's studying you," Nalin whispered, learning who her father is. "And who is that?" he asked, old doubts stirring. "A man who protects what he loves, who builds rather than destroys, who came through darkness and chose light." She touched his face with her free hand. "The man I chose, the man who chose me." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white. But inside their cabin, built from loss and hope in equal measure, the fire burned warm and steady. They were not unscarred, they were not unchanged, but they were unbroken. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The vast world waited beyond their walls, still cruel, still dangerous. But here in this moment, in this place they'd made, they had found what Jed had thought lost forever, not just peace, but purpose, not just survival, but a life worth living. Not just love, but love that had walked through fire and emerged refined. He kissed his daughter's forehead, then his woman's lips, tasting hope and sorrow and fierce joy all mingled together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, they were whole. Tonight, they were home. Thank you for listening to this story, and please share in the comments where you're listening from so we can connect as a community. Be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts in English.